Hi guys, welcome back to Tuesday's lecture for Gen Psych. Last time we started on chapter 13 on personality. We talked about some old theories, Freud's theory, Freud's psychodynamic theory, and we also talked about the humanistic perspective on personality. And then today we're going to finish up chapter 13 talking about some of the more modern contemporary views on personality and what makes us us. I've had a couple of you guys ask me about extra credit, and I wanted to just let you all know that there will be an extra credit opportunity. It goes along with the next chapter over psychological disorders. So I'll probably give you your lecture on Thursday, and then at the end of that lecture, I'll talk about the extra credit opportunity. It'll be worth 15 points, and I hope it'll be useful for you. I think you'll like it. So keep an ear out for that next time, because I'll give it to you next time. I think that's all the housekeeping I've got. So let's get rolling. Oh, also, my neighbors are redoing their roof or something, so I'm sorry if it's loud. Okay, so one of the contemporary perspectives we'll talk about is trait theories. And their definition of personality is stable and enduring behavior patterns, which, as I'm sure you have probably already noticed, is pretty much our definition of what personality is today. So this is the modern current definition of what personality is. So this is our characteristic behaviors. This is our conscious motivations. So it's what we do and why we do it. It's not this unconscious process like Freud thought it was. And one of our first trait researchers was Allport, and he described personality in terms of traits, identifiable fundamental traits that we all have on a different scale, where we all fall at a different place on the scale of one trait. So Allport and trait theorists in general were more concerned with describing traits, describing us, than explaining our traits and explaining why we do what we do, like Freud did. You know, Freud was trying to explain why we did things because our id and our superego were fighting because of our childhood experiences. So he was trying to explain why we were the way we were, but he wasn't trying to describe how we were with our traits. So that's what we're doing now. So basically what our first trait theorists did is they went through the dictionary and they just counted up all of the words that they could find to describe people. And they came up with like 18,000 words in the dictionary that could describe a person and their personality. And then what they did was they kind of, used factor analysis to find items that were related to each other. So for example, being outgoing, liking excitement, liking practical jokes, disliking the quiet. These are all in the same cluster that's related to extroversion. And so that's what they did. They narrowed things down that were related, and then they got our big 5 personality traits. And so currently our thoughts on personality is that we all kind of fall on a spectrum for these big 5 personality traits: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. The acronym for the big 5 is CANOE. I've also studied it as OCEAN, just as an easy memory tool to remember the big 5 personality traits. So conscientiousness is about being organized, being careful, being meticulous, very detail-oriented, disciplined, responsible. And we can kind of fall on any side of the spectrum of that. So we can either be high conscientiousness or low conscientiousness, fall on the other side. Agreeableness has to do with being agreeable, being open to doing what people ask, being soft-hearted, being trusting, helping other people, being agreeable. And you can, again, fall on either side of that spectrum. Same thing with neuroticism. So neuroticism is essentially your tendency to experience negative emotion. So anxiety, insecurity, self-pity, depression. People who experience those at a higher rate tend to be described as neurotic. And again, you fall on one side or the other. Same thing with openness. Openness is open to new ideas, open to variety, different things, being very independent. Same thing, fall on one side or the other. Same thing with extroversion. So extroversion is being sociable, enjoying high excitement, being very affectionate, and you can, again, fall on either side of those. The other end of extroversion would be introversion, right? So what is introversion? Introversion is gaining energy from time alone. So introversion is not shyness. Those are not the same thing. Introversion means that you gain energy from being alone, whereas extroverts gain energy, draw their energy from being around other people. So an introvert, after being in a social setting, they might still be talkative, be engaged, but after an hour and a half, they're exhausted, they're tired. And that's because introverts are just more sensitive to stimulation. Their brain baselines at just a higher stimulation, so or one part of their brain baselines at a higher stimulation, so it's really easy for them to get overstimulated. So they really gain energy from being alone and get exhausted from that high stimulation of being around other people. So it's not shyness. I think that's a quiz question. And there are lots of benefits of introversion. A couple that your book mentioned that I thought was interesting was that introverted leaders do better than extroverted leaders in some contexts. So they listen to their employees whenever their employees have new ideas, and introverted leaders are more likely to challenge the existing norms, which I thought was an interesting benefit of introversion. I'm going to have to look out for that in my future employers, see where I would put them on the scale and see if they are good at those things. The book also says that introverts handle conflict well. They are more likely to seek solitude and be alone rather than seek revenge. However, I don't know. I don't think that all conflict should be resolved with solitude and going off and being alone. I think that conflict resolution does involve some extra interaction than just seeking solitude. But I guess seeking solitude is better than seeking revenge. So there's that. So what do trait theorists do to assess personality, to assess traits? So remember, like Freud, what he would do is he would give projective tests and hope that people would project their unconscious motives onto those projective tests. But what we do now is we ask people questions about themselves. We give people a self-report questionnaire, which makes sense, right? People know themselves the best. So we give them a self-report questionnaire with this long list of questions about themselves. And the most commonly used one is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI. And essentially what this does is it identifies emotional disorders and personality traits. So it's funny, like in my personality assessment classes, we learn about the MMPI and measures like it, and what they do is they look for depression and anxiety and antisocial behavior and pathology and disorders instead of like extroversion and agreeableness and stuff like that. So usually personality assessments are actually looking at disorders and not necessarily personality traits, but they can be used to look at some of those personality traits. That's just not always their main function. So the MMPI was empirically derived and scored objectively, which basically means that we took a huge pool of true or false questions, and then we gave them to different groups of people: depressed people, anxious people, antisocial people. And then we kept the items that did a good job discriminating between who was in the depression category and who wasn't, who was in the anxiety category and who wasn't, etc. So what that means is that if an item No matter how silly or unrelated it sounded, if it identified a depressed person, then we kept it. So even if the item was, I like the comics in the news, if only depressed people really endorsed that item, then we kept it to identify depression. Even though it's not like a symptom that's related, if it was an item that only depressed people endorsed, then we kept it to identify depressed people. So that's what empirically derived means in that sense. The MMPI, technically there is a tendency for people to want to give the socially desirable answers at some points in time. And that might challenge, the validity of the results, might tell us, maybe what you want us to know instead of what's the truth. However, there are items on the MMPI that look for that kind of stuff and can tell us when people are trying to look better or even worse than they really are. So we can use those validity scales not only to tell us if people are trying to look good, but also if people are trying to look bad and trying to look like they have a disorder, trying to lie to physicians. So those validity concerns are all addressed in the assessment. I think this assessment is a good one. I like it. This is the one I plan on using. Some of you guys might even taken it before. You might not even know. Can't really give you items on it. You're not supposed to know about any of the items before you take it, because that influences how you respond. So the stability of personality. Essentially, personality traits become more stable as we get older. So like with IQ, if you remember, our intelligence, by the time we're like 11, it's very, very, very stable for our entire lives. And personality becomes more stable over time. So it's a little bit different. So you're more similar from age 50 to age 60 than you were from age 20 to 30. So as you get older, your personality becomes more stable. Okay, so that's trait theories. That's the big one. I think that's one of the biggest theories currently. But the other one is the social cognitive theory with Bandura's social cognitive perspective. And we talked about this a little bit in the learning chapter. Remember observational learning? Bandura was kind of the monkey see, monkey do. People will model what they see in their parents, what they see in their peers. And he says that that's really where we get a lot of our behaviors and thus a lot of our personality is by watching and observing and modeling other people. So that's kind of the social part of social cognitive theory, but the other part, cognitive, our own mental processes and our own thoughts also play a role. So, the way that we think about our situations that we're in, the way that we interpret events, and how our interpretation of events influences how we respond. So it is a social process, watching other people and modeling other people, but it also depends on our own thoughts about said models. So our personality is what drives our sense of self, how we view ourselves, what we think about ourselves. And there's a lot of interest in research in the field related to the self. The self is the organizer of your thoughts and feelings and actions. You're the one that the self is the one that chooses what to think and what to do. And remember in like the humanistic era of time, people did try to study the self, when they looked at self-concept and stuff like that. But it, didn't really get very far. We didn't really figure out a lot. So today's researchers really do focus on this idea of the self a lot. And one of the big parts of this self is self-esteem. So self-esteem is our feelings of self-worth, feeling good about yourself. And there's obviously lots of benefits to having high self-esteem, right? So some of the benefits that your book lists is that people with high self-esteem are less likely to conform to social pressures, right? Because they're more confident in their own decisions and their own selves, and so they're less likely to do what others tell them to do or what others are doing. They're also less shy, less anxious, less lonely, less neurotic. And they're just plain happier. They just rate higher on happiness rating scales. A couple others at your book list is that they have fewer sleepless nights. They're more likely to persist at difficult tasks. They're more likely to do and say more positive things, which in turn makes them more likable to other people. So lots of great benefits to having high self-esteem, right? Which you probably already knew. And you know, if you go to therapy, a big part of, you know, self-work is working on your self-esteem. It really makes a difference in how you view yourself, and how you view yourself in turn influences a lot about how you feel, how you function, how you view your world. So it's a big part of you. On the other hand, there are a lot of negative effects of having low self-esteem. We see that people who have low self-esteem, or even people who are made to have low self-esteem in the moment by being, you know, criticized on their performance or on their personality by a researcher, we see that people with low self-esteem are excessively critical of other people, which is really interesting because it shows that tearing someone down or feeling down makes you in turn tear others down, makes you want to judge others and criticize other people. Same thing with having a heightened prejudice. They're more likely to endorse, you know, racially prejudiced items, like on a questionnaire. They're more thin-skinned, more sensitive to criticism, and they're more judgmental of other people, kind of all along the same lines of just not liking yourself in turn makes you not like others and makes you want to tear other people down. So I thought it was interesting that the biggest influences of having low self-esteem is in turn how you treat other people. So yeah, something to consider, like with bullies, right? For example, a lot of the times people who are bullies have low self-esteem and don't feel good about themselves. So in turn, they project that onto other people and try to tear others down and criticize other people. However, we all also have this self-serving bias. So something that we all tend to have, even people with low self-esteem, is the self-serving bias, this readiness to perceive ourselves favorably. And we kind of talked about this in the last chapter, right, on the misattribution error. So we are more likely to accept responsibility for good things that we've done rather than the bad things. And then the bad things that we've done, we're more likely to attribute those to the situation. So we really have this readiness to perceive ourselves favorably. We want to do this. Even people with low self-esteem try to view themselves positively when they have the opportunity. Something else that's kind of related to the self-serving bias is our tendency to see ourselves as better than average. And this is true for almost anyone at almost any socially desirable behavior. So for example, if you ask employees how they think their work performance is compared to the typical average coworker, 90% of them will say that their job performance is superior, and less than 1% of people will say that they are below average. Technically, average is in the middle, which means 50% of people do above average and 50% of people do below average. That's just statistics. However, less than 1% of people will ever tell you that they think that they're below average, because we always want to view ourselves with the self-serving bias. We want to view ourselves favorably, and so we think that we're a lot better than we are. And it doesn't have to do with underestimating other people. It has to do with overestimating our own abilities. Self-serving bias. Something else that will, of course, make a huge impact on how you view yourself is your culture, right? So we kind of have this breakdown of two different kinds, realms of culture, so individualist and collectivist. So individualist cultures, like, Western countries like the US, have this emphasis on personal identity, personal traits, personal control, being an individual, and achieving for yourself. There's focus on being your own person, and there's a lot of value in the self. And being unique and really loving yourself and your independence is encouraged, right? That's what we all kind of strive for. Whereas in collectivist societies, like some Asian countries, the emphasis is more on the group and identifying with the group, because being with a group gives you a sense of belonging, and the group has this set of values that they subscribe to, and being in that group gives that sense of security. So they don't focus as much on the self as much as they focus on the group. And unlike in an individualist society, being unique and really loving yourself is considered disrespectful to the group. So you can imagine how living in these two different cultures could really lead to differences in how you view yourself, what your self-concept is, your self-esteem, your personality altogether, right? So for example, one study, when they asked people their thoughts on people who change their behavior depending on the people that they're around and the situation they're in, people in an individualist society were much more likely to say that person's being fake, or that person is being untrustworthy. Whereas in a collectivist society, people are much more likely to say that person is just being mature and they're still trying to be sincere. So just having those different values really influences how you interpret situations, interpret other people, and it influences your own personality. One example of our individualist tendencies is in the names that we give our babies, right? So Americans in recent years, the percent of babies who have common names has absolutely plummeted. So if you look at this graph in 2019, less than 10% of babies had common names. Like almost everybody's trying to make these really unique names, because we're individualists. We want to be unique. We want to be our own people. We don't want to blend into any group or anything like that. So this is just one thing that kind of illustrates how our culture influences lots of stuff about us, and especially our personality. Okay, that's all I got for you today. The quiz for this chapter or this lecture is due tomorrow, Wednesday at midnight. The next one will be posted on Thursday, where I'll talk about extra credit. So I'll see you guys later.